In this video, we're going to go over how to complete your textual analysis assignment. Specifically, we'll look at how to look through the digital archive at Readux to find text to explore, how to then import those texts into Voyant, a tool that allows you to do distance reading or textual analysis, and finally, how to record that experience on Voyant in Spyral notebooks. So the place to start is at the course shell, and we'll start with the course shell and go through all the way to the end of the assignment with an example. So if you haven't taken a glance at the assignment yet, go ahead and click on Assessments and then Dropbox. And all the assignments will be there. And what you'll want is Textual Analysis Project. As always, you can also find this in the content under week 2. What we're going to do today is go through all these steps so you can see examples of them and how this code works. So the first step is to open up Readux. We're using the legacy site because it has more text digitized. What Readux does is it gives us access to the archives at Emory University. And I've chosen these specific archives because there's 2 particular collections that'll be interesting to you in this class. And there's more than those 2, like there's so many different collections you could be interested in, but there's 2 I suggest you look at in regards to smoking culture. One is this Yellowbacks collection. So the Yellowbacks were novels that would be read on the train by Victorians. They were the cheap novels. They're called Yellowbacks because of the kind of paper. So they're what you would read if maybe you're traveling. What we call now maybe dime novels would be kind of a similar thing. So these are very popular novels, and there's quite a few volumes of them. This can give you an idea of how to supplement the canonical readings I'm having you look at. And you can engage them in similar ways to how we looked at the Pearson's Weekly ones, which were more popular. So that's one area. The triple deckers are kind of similar. Those are how novels were read in the time. So something like Middlemarch, a huge novel by George Eliot, the same person who wrote Daniel Deronda that you were part of during this class, would have been published in 3 parts. So those are kind of together. Those are 2 collections that are similar with Victorians. But there's another collection that I think would be very interesting for people to look at in this class, and that's the Methodism collection. The reason is because there are anti-smoking tracts in that collection. And Emory is a great place to get this kind of content because they have an excellent theological library and they have Methodist roots. So that explains why there's so much content in that area. But you are not restricted to those collections. Those are just ones I suggest to look at. What you should do when you're trying to figure out what you want to look at is try searching all volumes. Now you can do any kind of search. You can look for cigar if you're interested in cigars, look for pipe, you can look for smoke or tobacco. Now keep in mind some searches, for example, if I do CIG with an asterisk, as you see on the screen, that will give me everything that begins with CIG, and then it could be cigar, cigars, cigarettes. But keep in mind that you'll get things that are clearly before people in what is now Europe had access. So Ovid's not going to have anything about tobacco in it. So keep in mind that there will be times where maybe the OCR is incorrect. That's the character recognition, the way the machine reads the text. So don't trust everything you see in these searches. Let's say I want to change that. I'm going to look for tobacco. And you can see all these different things that maybe I want to use. And you can view it in PDF, you can download the PDF, or you can send it to Voyant. So you might want to look through a few and see what's going on with them. I'm going to send this in Voyant because this is Smoke Not, an essay from the Anti-Tobacco Society. That looks fascinating. I'm going to send that to Voyant, and that's the tool we're going to use to explore these texts. Once you send it to Voyant, you'll have these different windows that you can access with different tools. We have in the middle, you can see the text itself and engage it and look at what different words are doing and see they interact with each other. On the left, you have a word cloud, or called a cirrus. So cirrus for cloud, where you can see very common words happening. You can see trends on the right. You see the words in context. So let's say if I want to see the trend for tobacco, 23 instances, makes sense. We can see what's happening there. If I'm thinking I need to see that in context, I can add tobacco down here, and I can really see what's happening, and they all interact. So show me in the reader. Then in this bottom left area, we have a summary of the text where we can see its readability index, its average words, and also what the most frequent words are. So unsurprisingly, tobacco is the most frequent word. Sometimes you will get surprises though. So you can look at what comes up in these different texts. Now here we don't have as many words that are common words that we have to get rid of, but I want to show you how to do that. Let's say you have a novel and the #1 word's not tobacco like this anti-smoking tract, but it's the word like said or say, or if you look at Victorian text, you'll get Mr. and Ms. and Mrs. all the time. So with all of these, if you go and hover up, these tools will show up. And so you can export anything. You can choose another tool. So you're never limited to these tools. It's just the basic ones you see at first. So I suggest really explore and see what you can get more information from. But you can also define options. When you have these options open, there's this thing called stop words. So what stop words are in textual analysis is it says, here's a list of words that the computer will not consider in the analysis you're doing. So there's an auto list that includes like the and things like that, a and. You might want to add more. What you do is, so let's go through that again, is you hover over and it has any of these tools. And the one looks like a toggle button, says define options for this tool. Click that, then edit the list. See, there's already some here. So what I always add is hit enter. I add said. You maybe want to add Mr., Mrs., Miss, and you'll see from the word cloud what's coming up that's not useful for you. So this is something where you might think, and maybe it's kind of objective because I'm removing some things. I mean, subjective is what I mean, because it's removing some things. But it's part of the interpretive act. Close reading and distant reading are never too far from each other. They're always in dialogue. So you need to let the computer do some work for you. Then you need to look at it and say, is that really what I need? What can I do to get more at my research question? Hit confirm. And then if there was a lot of those, it would change them. So we can even say things like, okay, what's happening to tobacco? Look at it in context. We could say, oh, what's going on with time? And is that related to tobacco? How are they using time in this text? Don't feel like you're restricted to specifically words about smoking. Find a text that deals with it, a text that we don't read in this class, like this anti-smoking tract, and then make a claim based off it. So let's say I'm really excited about things I found, and I think I've looked at maybe trends or things like that, and I want to start recording it. So in Voyant, what we'll do is explore the text. Then we'll use something called Spyral notebooks to record our exploration of the text for an outside audience, for another researcher, for an educated general audience. We'll record what we're doing and why we're doing it and what our insights are about it. So here's the easy way to do that. You don't have to go to the Spyral website, but you could. I have it linked right here. You could go to Spyral. But once you find the one you're really happy with, let's say I really like this one, I can go up here and see this export button. I click that. Now I want to export the tools and data. See, it's this middle one. So I click the arrow to open the accordion area. I go to this third radio button, a new Spyral notebook from this tool and data. Click that. Click export. Now during this process, do not close this. You'll keep using it, okay? Keep it open because you have a special thing right there from Readux. So now let's look at Spyral. So you've looked at how to use Readux. You've looked at how to explore a text in Voyant. Now we're going to look at how do I work on that text. So here's Spyral Notebook. We're first going to kind of look at how this notebook works. And if you're in a discipline that uses Jupyter notebooks, this is accomplishing the same thing, where you go between coding, programming, and text. So it's a combination of providing code that can be run by a reader and your own essayistic analysis of what you're doing. This is called literate programming. And the idea is you don't want just code that no one can understand if they aren't part of the same either discipline or have the same coding languages. You want to have explanations. So the first thing you'll do is you'll rename this. Whatever you want to call your wonderful project. You'll put your name and authors. This is that metadata part. You'll add some keywords. So maybe I'm adding tutorial because I'm showing you how to do this. But maybe I still want, maybe I want Methodism because it has a religion and literature aspect. Maybe I want to have tobacco. Get 2 to 3 keywords that could be related to where you do future research on this, the kind of keywords you might have in a larger project. Give a description that will make sense to an outside audience of what you're trying to do. You might want to write this last, thinking about what your insights are from this, what text you're analyzing. Then you want to choose a license because this is practicing public facing, and this, you won't be sharing this with anyone, but this is on the web. It could be visible to someone if you gave out your link. I suggest thinking about one of the Creative Commons ones. And in the assignment, there's a link to find out what all these do. And then language, you just want to choose English for it. This relates to accessibility for your project. Metadata can be very important for both you as a researcher, as you're trying to find things, but also you as a researcher as you're making your own work searchable. So that would be the first part. Make sure that you have that filled in. Then at the end, you might want to have a little sentence here explaining what this is all about, welcoming people to it. I want to show you, so we have 2 different coding blocks. There's text coding blocks, which is a rich text editor. You can do anything you'd like as far as bold, block quotes, changing colors, changing styles, things like that, and a coding editor. Now, the way this is designed is that when you make a new one, it alternates, and that's what this plus sign is here. So if I want a new one, it's a text one. If I want a new one after that, it's a code one. If you hold Shift and press this button, you'll get the same one. And I can always delete, and I can always move them around. So we have right now, if I click here, this is what I brought up. It's loading the corpus, and it's just been imported. What the assignment requires is that you enter metadata, you then load the tool reader. I'll show you what the tool reader is in a moment. And that you have your visualization, and that you have the summary area. You don't have to write any of this. If you want to, you can, where you have the promise being made, the tool being used, and then how that tool is being used. But don't feel like you have to learn any of this language. We're going to export it all the way through. So here's the one that will be your final one in this group. What we'll need to do is I'm going to do Shift, and I'm going to add another coding cell and another one. And I'm going to put this down a few. Oops. There we go. And then I'm going to add a new cell. Remember, it alternates. Add a new cell. And by the way, when you're in the cell, you can always run the script to see if it works. And so let's say we want to go back to look at the project. And what you have to do is, we've done the metadata. Wonderful, that's done. You have your visualization in there. Now we need to bring these two. So how do I import the entire corpus? I could copy this into there and then change this middle part to what I see right here. See the highlighted part? But here's an easier way to do it. See, you're bringing in this one right here. This is the reader. I can just go ahead, export it, click there, a new Spyral notebook. And then what I do, I can just copy this. I can close that, go ahead and leave it, and keep yours open. And then put that in here and run it. Now the reader's available. So it can be as simple as that. Now you can look up, there are different tutorials on this, but for this project, it's just more of an experience of how this textual analysis works. How can I make it clear for an outside audience? And so then in this part, what I'm wanting to do, once I have the reader in there, here I want to explain what this text is and say, why did I select it? Because you're doing an important hermeneutical, important interpretive work as you're going through Readux and searching. Make that clear. Why did this interest you? And that'll be the first part. Then for the next one, I need to add that summary page. That's this one right here, which it gives you most frequent words, average words, things like that. Again, I can just export it. Export view, the new Spyral notebook, and I can just copy that. I can close this one so it gets out of my way. Go back to where my main space is, paste that. Remember the play button runs the script. Always do that to make sure that it's working. And what you want to do then is have one fact that you find interesting from this. It could be, if we look back, it could be that, are you seeing a correlation here between how there's some gender dynamics happening here, where it's speaking to men and young men possibly. And if you look through the correlation between life and smoking, how is that happening? Is that life's at risk because it's anti-smoking tract? Give us something interesting from this area. Then once those two are done, go down to that first one you brought in, the one where you really liked it, and see why is that interesting. Make a claim about it. This is going to be the part you write the most in here, where it has to be a substantive paragraph where you make a claim using your visualization as evidence. And so what you want to do is then go through and have a paragraph that says what you're interpreting from this. And here's an example from one of our own readings that we have. This is with Daniel Duranda, and it's looking at how are Duranda and Gwendolyn, how do those relate? And in this kind of project, what I would probably do is write about how they're seen as two separate novels linked by the theology of the shaman. So something like that. And so this is kind of a different example because I have close reading experience of the text. You will only have distant reading experience of the text. So go ahead and just see what you can make of it. Practice with distant reading and see what you come up with. So let's say now you've gone through all of this, you have all of your information, and you want to now save it. Because remember, don't close anything yet. You might still need this. And so this cloud is where you want to save it. Click the cloud icon. Save as. This access code, you want to keep that. I'm going to copy it. hit save. Okay, you now have a unique URL. You want to copy that too. What you want to send to me is this URL is what you're turning in. If you make a change, do a change there, then you want to keep saving it. You click save. Usually it'll ask for that access code. So it's because I'm in here, it didn't ask me for it. But if you leave this URL and then come back, or close this window and come back, it'll ask for that access code. So make sure you don't lose it. You'll need it to overwrite your previous one. You do not need to give me the access code. What you need to give me is this URL right here. That's what you'll submit along with the reflection that you complete. And again, that reflection is right here. When you finish that, you'll want to export the text that reflection. And what you'll submit in this assignment is you'll add that reflection text to add a file. And in the comments here, you will put this link. And then I should have access to it. If you have any trouble, like I'm noticing there's some trouble happening here with this one, go ahead and let me know. We can set up a Zoom session and troubleshoot it. What's likely happening is I need to instead pull this over. We'll find a way to work that out and to have it in Readux in a way that works for you. So go ahead and have fun with the textual analysis. See what you can discover that's different than a close reading. And I look forward to seeing all of your projects.